Hello, my name is John Barry. I'm Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University, Belfast. The pandemic has cancelled the future, but that's okay. It was a pretty bad one anyway. We should, as we're thinking about recovery from the pandemic, resist the calls to return back to normal. Normal was the problem. Normal was an ecocidal, unsustainable economic system based upon unsustainable globalization, creating more inequality in our societies, creating a less resilient food system, for example, as we're now discovering in the context of the pandemic. So I think we should think about building back better to see that as we come out of this crisis, we should see that we can deal with the public health issues around COVID-19, as well as dealing with other public health issues, such as improvements in air pollution around our cities, which we already see as a result of economic activity based on carbon energy being reduced. Address issues such as energy poverty by a massive upscaling of insulation of houses, particularly for those in low income. Invest in innovation and training for low carbon green jobs, and effectively begin the process of a new industrial revolution based around the principles of the Green New Deal and a just transition so that workers, communities, consumers are not disproportionately badly affected as we make the transition away from coal, oil and gas in particular. So it seems to me that we should resist calls for returning to normal. And I do think that when we look at how societies, communities and states have reacted to the pandemic, it gives us some lessons or perhaps some elements of hope that we can deal with a much greater crisis. But what have we learned from the pandemic? Well, there are a number of things. One is that states do have agency. Despite decades of neoliberalism and the promotion of that the market is best and privatization are the most efficient ways to organize production and consumption, we now see that states can move very quickly and have a lot of agency, particularly in the context of a crisis. We've also learned that populations can move and adapt quickly to new behaviors, social distancing, working from home, and other diminutions of our civil liberties, at least temporarily, for the sake of a much greater prize of reducing the chances of the most vulnerable in our society from contracting COVID-19. We found that agency is also possible in the context of finance, that there is perhaps a magic money tree, that austerity was a lie, that the state can find the resources. Often it's usually to fight wars, as we've seen in the mobilisation of a lot of people, munitions, men, women, and other affiliated army paraphernalia for the war in Iraq in 2003. But now we see the state mobilising to protect life. We've seen the state engage in what once was thought as impossible, utopian policies such as universal basic income, as they've implemented in Spain and Ireland and Britain in terms of furloughed workers and so on. We've also learned that it's possible to communicate complex issues to our populations visually. You know, we're all now familiar with the idea of flattening the curve to try and stretch out the peak and lower the peak of the pandemic to make sure that our NHS and other healthcare systems are not overburdened as a result of so many people presenting with the virus. Well, I think we can learn from that and see, well, can we move from flattening the curve to actually bending the curve? And the curve I'm talking about here is greenhouse gas emissions, to show publics that there are ways in which through, changes in our lifestyle, in transportation, reducing our intensity and use of carbon for our energy, considering reducing our red meat consumption, minimizing our production of waste going to landfill. There's a whole range of ways in which individual and collective action can mean that we can begin to bend the curve down of greenhouse gas emissions and begin to address the planetary emergency. We've also seen that there are positive short-term, perhaps environmental impacts of what's happened with the crisis in terms of air quality increasing in China, in Italy, London, indeed even here in Belfast, as people are driving less. And I do think there's something around seeing what in this crisis is positive and what can we learn from, what do we want to see continue as we come out of this crisis. We've also seen, of course, that there's been negative economic impacts. This has been an unplanned crisis, and therefore any of the transition elements around reducing our carbon use and so on have not been planned, and therefore it doesn't give us a good guide as to how we should plan our decarbonisation transition process. But we have to begin to have that conversation in our society about decarbonising our economies in terms of energy, in terms of food, because the reality is that we have become addicted as societies, structurally dependent upon carbon energy. So we need to move to a renewable energy economy. And that's what I think the advantages of looking at the positives in this pandemic are, in terms of how states can move, how populations can adapt to different lifestyles, different ways of working from home, and begin to see the possibility that another world is possible in terms of what would this transition look like that we're going through now if it was planned, if it was signalled in advance to populations, if there were civic assemblies to discuss how we should green and create a less carbon intensive, more inclusive society. Begin to offer a vision of a post-capitalist society, that we can see the end of capitalism as more possible now than the end of the world. Provocative ideas, but we should never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, crises are opportunities for radical social, economic, and indeed cultural transformation. And perhaps that's what we're in at the moment. But it's all to play for. There is no guarantee that we will have a green and inclusive recovery. It is going to take lobbying and struggle and citizens to demand they want to build back better. So the pandemic has cancelled the future, but that's okay. It was a pretty bad one anyway. Thank you.